I already had problems which title to choose for my presentation. From artists to cultural entrepreneurs, that was easy. But then, now it is really, are we going to speak about neoliberalism instead of democratization? Or should I put it differently? For example, neoliberalism versus gradualism. I was told that you are not familiar with this word gradualism, but gradualism is very important for Slovenia. This is that we went for transition step by step, gradually, and not over the night. So that we, for example, didn't want to privatize our banks. We didn't want to privatize our big corporations, big factories, and so on. And so we became a kind of problem for European Union because of this kind of third way. But when then 2009, the crisis came, we were trapped by the idea that our crisis is a consequence of gradualism. And we had to privatize very quickly our banks and all family silver. So that's why I was hesitating how to put it. And later on, you will understand that while gradualism I found very positive regarding Slovenian economy to a certain extent and for that time, I find, for example, gradualism in public sector, and especially in the arts sector, very, very problematic. So Olga Tokarczuk, she won this Nobel Prize for Literature, and she's from Poland. Before this last state elections, she said, "For me, these elections are the most important since 1989, when communism fell. It is a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. I'm afraid that the choice is even harder, but not only in Poland, but all over democratic world. Namely, we are faced with the race of populism, but not the populism as an emancipatory social force through which marginalized groups challenge dominant power structure. So, as a kind of positive force for emancipatory change in the society, but rather as anti-intellectualism and anti-individualism, which are hostile towards, among all others, the arts and the artists. Why populism is so extremely dangerous for sound society? Because there were no more political ideologies that were, or at least pretended to have some higher community-oriented goals. Instead, they are replaced with radical simplification, with cheap rhetorics, with some kind of demagogy. Because the politics became consumable commodity as any other and not anymore a public cause. Because the politicians use market approaches that turn citizens into merely consumers. They think, consumers, that as individuals we can make choices, but in reality, we are only chosen to create the appearance of democracy. Because alienated from our own needs, we have become an easy target for businesses of all kinds, from media to political businesses. There was an interesting conference I found on the internet taking place in May in Prague, really addressing the very same questions, asking what next. So, can we speak about the elites in power that have not delivered their democratic promise? Does it stand for cultural elites as well? Namely, the result of the elites' failure would be very scary, a kind of a turn from the enlightened demos to consumeristic populace that is manipulated by big corporations, losing autonomy, and in fact, we as consumers losing certain freedom. So that the political ideology from the totalitarianistic time is being slowly replaced by market ideology, resulting in a different type of suppression, but still suppression of freedom. Culture, this might be true in the context of the end of history, what is written here. But now, when we are facing the new democratic enemy, populism and populistic politics, can we still agree with Andrzej Wajda's saying that arts and culture has nothing profound to tell anymore? It was possible to understand that when we were so suddenly, we believed in the end of history. But this might not be true anymore in the context of this new enemy, this race of populism. Culture policy is a European phenomenon. It is well known that culture policy is a European invention, very much related to the European idea of nation state, nationhood building, national identity. According to this idea, culture is conceived in Europe as public good, eligible for state support and budgetary funding. However, this phenomenon is at the moment at the crossroads. Will it go towards populistic nationalism, losing its progressive, enlightened character, or will it go closer to the human rights perspective? So we are really speaking, I am convinced of that, at this very moment of wake-up call of arts and artists to somehow redefine their position in these new realities. But then this very tricky and provoking question, culture institutions, between nationalistic or opportunistic tendencies even. And what is Czech situation regarding this provoking challenge? So this observation is absolutely relevant in Southern and Eastern Europe. Why? I will cite now the leading culture policy analysts from the Southern and Eastern Europe, not to be too partial, speaking only on my views. So, cultural institutions established under the socialist regime have taken a conservative position over the past 20 years of transition and have been presenting their existence as a matter of national interest. This is the quotation from Vjeran Kutonaric from Croatia. Then, this reactionary standpoint has resulted in a professional, technological, and infrastructural standstill. Nada Švob Đokić, also from Croatia. A kind of institutional fatigue, said Dragan Klajić. According to Dunja Blažević, also she's from Bosnia and Herzegovina, the collectivist idea, the rule of the working class, was replaced by another one, the rule of the ethnic nation. On the one hand, these institutions are overstaffed, and on the other, their staff lack modern professional competencies and skills in public relations, marketing, fundraising, human resources, and so on. Quote from Milena Dragičević-Šešić. Besides, the leading posts in culture institutions and culture administrations have been overtaken by politically nominated figures, often without adequate professional references. Also one quote. Or, as the Croatian Minister of Culture once pointed out, Croatia has good policy thinkers, but not policy doers. So, I would like to address different approaches to show not only, we will search for similarities afterwards, but let's see differences. So that's why I've decided for two radically different examples. On one hand, we have Slovenia with this frozen situation. So how the transition in the arts and culture has not been completed yet. And then we have another example in Estonia, how the transition went away from democratization towards the neoliberal paradigm. First of all, there is a huge divergence between different parts of post-socialist countries, as we know. Ex-Yugoslavia and Slovenia, as one of its 6 republics, was not a typical communist country, while still maintaining a one-party political system with totalitarian characteristics. Some elements of political pluralism, market economy, and civil society had been introduced, resulting in a kind of, for example, in the 80s, we already have quasi-democracy, So the pluralism of so-called self-management interests. We have so-called self-management society composed of producers and consumers with a very relevant, strong peer evaluation. We already then had quasi-market culture organizations were allowed to generate their own earnings, or to say in a very legal way, they were separate legal entities with their own bank accounts. And quasi-civil society, an independent culture scene operated under the legal status of associations. These associations were supposed to be especially for amateur arts, but in fact, in Slovenia, they were used as a legal forum for independent cultural producers. And why were allowed this kind of alternative, sometimes very provocative ensembles? Because they were closed in very close circles. They were not mainstream groups, so they were allowed. That's why I'm speaking about somehow quasi-civil society. So therefore, to free arts and culture from strict ideological slavery was not enough like in other socialist countries we can imagine. The culture sector expected something more from the promise of democracy, only it had no idea of what that might mean or how it could be accomplished. Neither elected politicians, but nor the culture elites had the vision or the pragmatic knowledge to conceptualize and achieve the development of a new democratic European-like culture policy. Moreover, the culture system, which had been privileged in the previous era by having the task of ideological legitimization of the socialist social order, lost its ideological position and became a sector as any other. Therefore, its main concern became how to protect its existence and not how modernize it. You see? How to protect what has been gained during the self-management system. So, in the time, I don't know how was in Czech Republic, but in that time in Slovenia, we still believe in democratic artistic heaven in the West. We didn't notice that there was already going on a paradigm of new public management, in a way something that is very close to managerial paradigm, to all this efficiency, effectiveness, market philosophy, and so on. We were not aware of that. As a result, culture elites preserved their previous position in this kind of situation. They didn't know what to do. Politicians gave up. Culture became an internal affair, so it was the most secure to preserve the existing situation. What a paradox. The sector that inspired in the 80s the historical tectonic changes hasn't found its intrinsic power to adjust its organization and management to the democratic shift it evoked. It was really a paradox. Because in Slovenia, for example, first demos, democratic government, was composed of 5 freelancers in the field of arts and culture. 5 people. Even Janez Janša, now very controversial right-wing leader, was in that time freelancer, cultural independent worker. However, culture, like sports, lost its previous central role to be window shop of communist countries, a tool for ideological legitimization, even replacement of nation state, for example, in Slovenia, or a playground for pluralism. So, in the absence of democracy, culture had a very prominent position. And after the independence, this position was lost. By losing all these fundamental roles, it has been marginalized, now being put on the margin of political agenda. The result is no budgetary injections investing in modernization of cultural infrastructure. Status quo indeed. The state still acts as an owner of powerful cultural institutions of the public sector, museums, operas, theaters, and so on, established under the self-management period. Nowadays, when the position of artists of state is no longer possible, a large part of artists is not ready to imagine anything else but the change towards the artistic assisted by state, to remain artists assisted by state, expecting from public authorities to get social security and subsidies for creation. The tradition gap was, of course, related also to the situation that, for example, European Union, there is a principle of subsidiarity. So while agriculture in Slovenia has been reformed really in depth, culture has remained intact. So again, something that not speak in favor of some structural reforms, some modernization. So in 1997, so how many years ago? 20 years ago, the Slovenian Minister of Culture, Jožef Školč, said, instead of democratizing the engine, its passengers were activated. But not all passengers, not independent cultural production, and not younger generation. They were outside. They were not included in this heaven. Therefore, some kind of deprofessionalization could be considered as one of the main problems of public sector. Why public sector suffers from institutional fatigue? Then the main victims are NGOs and independent artists, and of course, no serious investment in infrastructure. Incredible, I noticed in Czech Republic, also in Estonia, that a lot has been invested in renovation of and even new buildings in the field of arts and culture. Not in Slovenia. In Slovenia, everything went to another direction. So the only priority, not just first priority, but the only priority are salaries of public servants. In Slovenia, all employees in public sector are still public servants. So you see this switch that 20 years ago, 40% went for salaries and 60% for programming. And now this ratio is vice versa. Already 60 and more percentage goes for salaries for public servants who are now in average 50 years old. And then, of course, as a result of this technological and infrastructure standstill, what we are witnessing, and especially something which I call generational apartheid in my country. And it's interesting that using such a strong word, there has been no reaction to it, because you know, those who are satisfied with status quo are the most powerful cultural circles in Slovenia. So I call this situation without any response some kind of conspiracy of silence. Even if I lose generational apartheid and no feedback. So NGOs are really losers, while cultural institutions are still considered a legal obligation of public authorities. Public support to the independent culture scene remains optional. So if funding remains, then it goes for support of independent culture producers. And of course, freelancers, precarious cultural professionals, they are also big losers. But what is for me now, after 25 years, crucial is this consequence. This is not at all anymore social problem. This is, in Slovenia, developmental problem. To exclude so many competencies and skills, because our younger generation, for example, both my children, they are more educated than I am. And then to leave this younger educated people outside the art system, this is really a catastrophe. So how is it possible to maintain this status quo? Because in Slovenia, everybody is innocent. You know, this organized innocence. Minister, he is not responsible because he has in Slovenia 17 working expert commissions that are distributing this public funding that remains after salaries are covered, so small, like 10%. Then members of these expert commissions, they are innocent because they are taking a decision collectively. So I did not go for this decision, but they overcome me. So you see, and the less guilty are cultural administrators in the ministry. Why? Because they are so happy to be just bureaucrats that have nothing with distribution of public funding, since everything is delegated to this experts commission. So really, alibi for all that are somehow engaged in this art system which is in power now. So, you know, this organized innocence is very much connected with arm's length principle. And arm's length principle, perhaps in the time of ideological pressure, it was important. But nowadays, when everybody can say whatever want, this is not so. Now, this is a kind of exit for public authorities regarding responsibility for arts and culture as public good. You see? So that's why arm's length principle should be taken into consideration with some critical approach as well. And what's going on? We have in Slovenia legislative fever, legislative fallacy, a kind of legislative inflation. So many laws, everywhere these laws, but then a gap between legislation and implementation. And we have inflation of strategic papers. Do you remember the quote from the minister of Croatian minister? We have public cultural policy thinkers, but where are cultural policy doers? And what is really, I am a lawyer by my professional background, so I am very much focused on details. And one detail that tells you everything about how serious Slovenian culture policy is that all four cultural policy strategic plans, 4 years plans, have been adopted with consensus. Wow, it must be something wrong. How that all are happy? Because these plans are shopping lists. Everything is there, so everybody is happy. And if there is no priority, if there are 50 priority, then this is really a cry, something that don't speak in favor of transparent cultural policy, but it is more a masquerade. So, in absence of cultural policy changes, general reforms made all changes that has happened up till now in Slovenian culture policy, in cultural sector. And of course, these changes have not been tailored according to the artistic needs. You see? So, for example, public sector with all these public servants playing violin in opera, acting in theater, and so on. This is not something that would work in the field of creativity, I think. Then we have, instead of material culture, we have now procedural culture. All these processes, and of course, the main, who is the most responsible, is European Union itself. Now we are dealing with audit society. We are all the time somehow caught in all this reporting, auditing, all these kind of things. But nobody really takes time for serious evaluation, for following up the results. And then this kind of results should be then step when you decide about future funding. And of course, reform of local self-government. I am very proud that in the 90s, I did everything in my power. I was in that time deputy minister or somebody, assistant minister, and I did anything in my power to prevent decentralization in Slovenia. Why? We, in that way, preserve funding for arts and culture because local communities have other priorities. They are not in such a small country as Slovenia, when they have 500 to 5,000 people, they are not strong enough to take care of theaters, of professional museums, and so on. So we somehow preserve this situation that all professional theaters in Slovenia and all the big museums are still funded by central authority. But now this is not anymore such an advantage. This is now a problem. Why? Because of this comfortable situation, nothing has happened in terms of structural changes, that you would do something very progressive then with this money. This unfortunately did not happen. And Estonian example is completely different. The beginnings are the same. Of course, this awakening in 19th century, and then 2 decades they had independent state, Slovenia never, but we were part of Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and yes, we got a lot of Slovenian professional cultural organizations in that time. So a characteristically Western modern social structure gained ground also in Slovenia, like in Estonia, in these 2 decades. After Western modernity in the Baltic states was replaced by Soviet modernity. I am not going to speak about that, because about that you know, you don't know, you are too young. Half of audience is too young to know that it was really a problem to be so very much suppressed, high censorship, and for example in Estonia a hidden Russification. For example, in 1938 there were just 60% of Russian people, but then 90%. So it is really a huge decrease. Hidden Russification is then one of the problems, not only totalitarianism of Soviet Union. And then in 1991, these poor people, they believed in this democratic, artistic heaven that they too easily confused with market economy. They were really market believers, and they really went for decentralization and for empowerment of market and related privatization. Thus, the main concern was how to get rid of state, and the market was considered as a promise for freedom. Obviously, Estonians, like Slovenes, we both didn't notice this new management paradigm going on in West. So they decided for market, and they decided for this new management ideology. It has included statements like there is no such thing as a free lunch, money doesn't grow on trees. Together with these slogans, the new public management ideology with these three S's, so economic value, effectiveness, and efficiency. So all this modeled the general understanding of the state, economy, and culture in last, let's say, 25 years almost. But now they had elections, and new government took a position, and for the first time, not more social democrat-oriented government, and not any more right-wing, liberal-oriented government. And you know, they made incredible success and developments with this neoliberal paradigm. For example, Estonia has now almost the same GDP per capita as Slovenia. By the way, Czech Republic has bigger. And 20 years ago, you had 1/3 of our GDP per capita, and now you have bigger. So it would be interesting for me how this reflects in the field of arts and culture here in Czech Republic. However, extremely low national debt, when expressed as a percentage of GDP, now gives this new government, Estonian government, possibility for a switch from investment in infrastructure, which went especially through European Union funds, now to switch to the investment to people and to programs. So can we therefore say that both countries need structural changes? So Slovenia towards more open, inclusive and dynamic culture policy model, and Estonia a step back from neoliberalism. I am used to say, you know, there are no strict answers to this kind of questions. We are dealing with spendium. In Estonia, this spendium has gone towards neoliberalism too much. In Slovenia, it has gone towards gradualism or status quo too much. So you see how to find a balance. In Slovenia, we believe modernization of public sector is a precondition for structural changes. Why? Because we have to create some space for independent cultural sector and also for independent artists. Because we cannot count for new money, for fresh money. Why not? Because Slovenia gives 2% of central budget to arts and culture. That's why it has been possible to maintain this status quo. For example, in Czech Republic, I heard that it is less than 1%, but nevertheless, you get much more money from from local self-governments. But nevertheless, it tells something that, so we have money for arts and culture, we just need somehow to restructure it. Then inclusion of NGOs in culture policy model, and make stop to the precariat. This is the main thing, I believe. When we speak about cultural institutions, I believe that I am etatist, because now state is not anymore a danger for freedom. State in Slovenia with small cultural market is the only one who can provide for stability, but in the Slovenian cultural production, for Slovenian cultural vitality. With 2 million people, market cannot be an answer, you see? That's why cultural institutions, for me, should stay as public sector, but not as a structure, as infrastructure, as place with enough of fluidity, flexibility, that could mobilize all artistic cultural resources and not be static as it is at the moment. And then, of course, we need, instead of bureaucratization, we need to refocus on the evaluation, to see what is done with public funding, what are the results, and to really establish solid objectives to follow then with funding. So I would say culture mission should be before employees, because in Slovenian culture institutions some kind of privatization happened, because if public servants are untouchable, this is a kind of privatization of working posts, isn't it so? So what we need to do is to subordinate employment to cultural mission, to cultural programs. And then we need organizational heterogeneity. So we need to create place for modern production schemes that is much more developed in sphere of independent culture. Then we need some kind of deregulation to bring new dynamism, or I would say re-regulation. That one that would bring more freedom to the field. NGOs need to be recognized as alternative production model, and a measure, there need to be a quota for them, already decided as a separate item line in budget. You understand what I mean? Because it should not be allowed that minister himself or ministry, when because of these very, very, very strong public unions in Slovenia, all the time are raising salaries, that Minister of Culture then take money away from independent sector to cover legal obligation, so salaries. Then presumption of employment to combat precariat. What is presumption of employment? When artists are in relation of economic dependency with one employer, because they are often working for them and for him or her regular employer, and within the premises and within resources and so on. These already have all elements of regular employment. It could be for fixed time, but it should not be contract-based, so run by civil law, but should be employment contract, so contract of service, that also have all the social rights integrated. And then what is really needed, I will not speak about state corporativism, it would take too much time, and I'm running out of it, existence of independent culture policy research. This is really something that needs to be established in Slovenia. We don't have a serious institute that would go for culture policy research and so on. And also we need informed culture policy as a means of demystification, or as a means to overcome culture policy as a merely advocacy and lobbying and distribution as such. And what we also need, the main thing is responsibility, professionalization. So to integrate more expertise in everything, also in evaluation, is distribution, formulation and implementation of culture policy. And of course, please keep in mind, not arm's length principle. Nowadays, we need arm-in-arm principle. We need public authorities being aware of the importance and power of arts and culture. Modernization formula for me is something that could be understood as controversial. It is combination of strong state and strong civil society. And then reaffirmation of public value of arts and culture as public good, as public cause, as public responsibility. And post-managerial paradigm, you can imagine what this is. So, just to conclude, here you see three people. In the middle, I am. On my right is Mitja Rotovnik. Rotovnik used to be one of the most famous, most successful directors of the biggest Slovenian culture institution for years. And on my left side is the director of Slovenian Opera, used to be director of Slovenia Opera House. We are now searching for new cultural policy model, but very competent people now. So we produced 100 pages long document. Nobody wants to discuss that from the culture field, even not independent association of independent cultural organizations. Why not? Because also independent sector tries to become public sector and don't see in this kind of dynamic, flexible and responsive system an alternative for themselves. Thank you. Or time for questions, or we will do that later.
We do still have some time for questions. Are there any questions? Or we can also leave them for the discussion later on. Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to ask about this post-managerial paradigm that you mentioned briefly. If you could expand on it a little bit.
This new public management is based on managers. So people who are able to manage arts and culture according to market philosophy. And for example, in one of Slovenian major theater in Nova Gorica, at certain period, the manager who used to be the president of Commerce Chamber of Slovenia overtook the role of theater director. You see? And this is not how you should handle or manage cultural institutions. You should, for example, create a very good studying program that would empower people from cultural sector who are already educated in arts and culture to get additional managerial skills and competencies, you see? And this is post-managerial approach.
Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Just a comment. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting for me to hear that you have also some problems in Slovenia, because from the outside perspective, it sometimes looks like that, like for example, in terms of the art museums, for me they are much more dynamic than static, or if we compare them to our institutions, I would say that they are much more dynamic than our institutions are. So thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, I would like to ask about the period of self-management in Yugoslavia. How did it look like in arts and culture, actually? Because I thought it's mostly the matter of economy or agriculture, maybe. So that's why I'm asking, how did it look like in arts and culture, this system of self-management?
In ex-Yugoslavia, education, health, culture and arts, all was somehow, it was kind of arts councils or education council and so on, but differently composed of representatives of users and representatives of producers, of cultural people. But what happened in that time? That users were highly overcome by producers. This asymmetric information, you know, producers had in that time all information, and users were just there more for appearance, for this kind of positive appearance. So already self-management system didn't work rather well. But of course, there are some good consequences, even now, some positive legacy. Unfortunately, I haven't had enough time to go more also in positive, because there are many positive implications of self-management system still now. But you know what was the main problem? After independence Slovenian, instead of preserve self-management ideology or philosophy within economic sector, so in economy, to make workers to become owners and so on of their own factories and so on, to go for another path, we there went to a hard economy, economic liberal, neoliberal model, while in public sector we have this very powerful legacy of self-government, which is a problem. Why? Because, for example, in museum like this, the governing structure, so governing board, would be composed of people who are employed here, and also from people from the ministry and some imaginary users. So that's why privatization sort could happen, because employees in governing board became a kind of bosses, of directors. In my country, director is the only who has mandate, 4 years, 5 years mandate, and hands like that. Why? Because public servants are untouchable. You see, in public sector happened what should have happened in economy.